Today on Ministry Monday, I am speaking to Emily Strand and Eric Styles. Hi, you guys. How are you today?
Great, Amanda. How are you?
Good
I'm good.
morning.
I'm good. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you both for being on Ministry Monday today to talk about Father Rivers. So, you both are hosts of the Meet Father Rivers podcast, and we have been lucky enough to feature a few of the episodes on Ministry Monday, but I have never had the chance to sit down with both of you and chat about the genesis of the podcast, and then, of course, how you met Father Rivers, and then, of course, the podcast itself and Father Rivers itself himself. So I thought it would be a good place to start by just asking Father Rivers, how did you both meet or encounter Father Rivers? Either of you can start.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for featuring our show on Ministry Monday. As I'm sure many of your listeners know, I am a NPM member as well, and I really value music ministers' perspectives. So, hi out there. So I was a graduate student at the University of Dayton, and I was asking lots of questions about liturgy. And UD is not necessarily known as a center for liturgy. It's more American Catholic Studies. And so that's their wheelhouse. And so that's kind of how they answered my questions, in terms of, well, why does Catholic liturgy sometimes seem different, in terms of the musical styles involved than many of the Protestant churches that I had visited with my friends from college. I went to a Methodist undergrad, University of Evansville. And so at Dayton, they said, well, there's some history there that you should look into. And Dr. Cecilia Moore, who is a wonderful member of the faculty there at Dayton, has been for many years, she said to me, there's somebody you should talk to in Cincinnati. His name is Father Clarence Rivers. And this was in about 2002. And she said, he's a bit eccentric, but I bet he'd talk to you. He's a really interesting figure. She didn't tell me a whole lot more than that. So I called him, and I agreed within about 5 minutes of talking to him, more like 30 seconds of talking to him, that he was a bit eccentric. And but he said, well, just come over and we'll talk. So I said, okay. And so I went over to his house. I was in north of Cincinnati, and he was down right in Cincinnati on Erkenbrecher Avenue. And so I ended up interviewing him several times and writing a paper for Dr. Moore's class about him, which then went on to be the foundation of my master's thesis. So I ended up writing my master's thesis about him, and got to attend liturgies at which he presided, and that he had some design influence over, and got to interview him several more times, and he introduced me to people. So really that was and then I defended my master's thesis, and 2 days later got a phone call from Father Paul Marshall that Father Rivers had died. And so it was a short encounter and somewhat fleeting, but it was really, I had a long lasting impression on me.
Thanks, Emily. So part of our story in the podcast is we tell these stories about our meeting. So, shameless plug. I met Father Rivers. It had to have been similar in time, a little bit earlier than Emily. Might have been 99, 2000. And I was living in Cincinnati. I went to the University of Cincinnati. I'm originally Chicagoan. And I was at the University of Cincinnati, and I was worshiping in a parish called St. Martin de Porres, a parish of happy memory, no longer there. And we were downtown. I'd heard about Father Rivers. I had read his name. The original Lead Me, Guide Me hymnal is dedicated to him. And I'd heard his name, read about him, but not seen him or met him. And so we were at the cathedral in Cincinnati during November, which is Black Catholic History Month, for a special liturgy. And there were a number of people, number of priests and deacons there, and I was looking to see were there any Black priests or deacons that I had never met as they were processing in. I was in the choir behind the altar, and I don't remember exactly what song we were singing at that time, but I remember seeing someone in what I would call, a rather drab chasuble. That's the outer garment that the priest wears. And with all the others wearing the same chasuble, but he had on a bright blood red alb, which is kind of a contradiction because alb is the root word of alb is white, right? The undergarment that ministers wear at the liturgy, or the basic garment, I should say. And it was bright red with blood red and red, black, and green embroidery on the skirt and on the sleeves, and gold with gold thread, and then he had on a pectoral cross. A giant pectoral cross was black with a black dove in the middle of it, red, black, and green. He had on rings on his fingers. He had a bald, shaved head, goatee, and studs, diamond studs in his ears. He had on horn-rimmed glasses on his nose, kind of low down his nose, and he was a very short man. And then the pièce de résistance were the red patent leather gym shoes, red patent leather filas with tan soles. And so that really, really blew my mind. And I leaned over and said, "Who is that?" I mean, literally while we're singing, "Who is that?" And the person next,
which means the outfit achieved its effect.
That's right. And the person next to me says, "Oh, that's just Father Rivers." And I kid you not, I knew I sang with greater enthusiasm and excitement after realizing who that was. And I remember thinking, if he can be Catholic, I can be Catholic. Right? Like, if he can be Black and Catholic, because he was just so Black, right? I could be Catholic. And I didn't meet him that day. I met him later, also sent by my pastor to meet him at his house on Erkenbrecker. And he became a mentor for me, and I think a friend, and spent a good bit of time with him. Was able to work on a couple of projects with him over the course of those years, and he died in 2004. So probably about 5 or so years, got a chance to be in his presence and talk to him regularly. I talked to him the day he died, so not knowing it, of course, and just a huge impression.
So both of you encountered him separately.
Mm-hmm.
How did you both, meet each other and then decide to do the podcast? What was the genesis story there?
Well, we kept hearing about each other.
Mm-hmm,
this is after he died, years after he died. We kept hearing about each other.
Well, and I remember sitting at his funeral at the cathedral, which is very crowded. There's lots of people there. And I remember, and I was with my parents, and I remember looking around the room and thinking, I don't know any of these people. Like, I only met him for just a brief amount of time, and I don't know these people. And I feel like he was my way into something that I found really exciting and really life-giving, namely Black Catholicism, and especially American Black Catholicism. And I just had been so enthused about being part of that and tapping into that through him that I thought it felt cut off to me. And I thought, I don't know how to approach these people. I don't know who these people are. And Eric was part of that, because Eric was serving at the funeral, and his name was listed on the back as somebody who, participated in the planning of it and everything. And then for years people would say, I was talking to somebody the other day and he reminded me a lot of you. It was weird. He's really excited about liturgy, and then also kept talking about Father Clarence Rivers. And I was like, people would say, you're the only other person I know who talks about Father Clarence Rivers. And I was like, who is this guy? Well, he's a Jesuit, he's a novice, so I don't know, somebody gave me an email address for him at one point, and I reached out to him, but it was not the right email address, because now I know Eric actually does respond to emails, especially when the subject is Father Clarence Rivers.
Right. That was off by one letter. That's it. That's all it takes.
Eric J. Styles or something.
It's
that's not his email, everyone. It's not his email.
Yeah.
He doesn't want the email. I'll take the email. Meetfatherrivers@gmail.com. So we finally, the pandemic hit. George Floyd died, was murdered. And I had a growing feeling over the past few years, even before that, that the father, I was an early adopter of podcasts. So I've been podcasting since like 2007. And so I've always believed in the platform, and it's really exploded, in the last 5 years or so. And so I was thinking, I've always thought I need to do stuff with my work on Father Rivers. Dr. Moore has always talked to me from UD. She's always said, you had really something very exclusive there. You had these thoughts that he shared with you, and always encouraged me to do something. I've given lectures about him. I've written articles about him, but it never seemed enough. It never seemed like I was really reaching people with who this person is and why. When everybody else's jaws were hitting the floor with regard to what happened to George Floyd and so many other, Black people in the face of police brutality, why my jaw wasn't on the floor. I just felt like I already knew something about this story, and I already had a perspective beyond myself. There's so many people reaching out, wanting to get this perspective, beyond themselves. And I thought, as a young person, I had this handed to me on a gold-plated platter by Father Rivers, and I was able to.
Literally,
I've been able,
gold-plated.
Literally gold-plated, and I've been able to carry that. I'm so many insights just about why would he dress like that? Why is it why did Eric look at somebody dressed like that and say he's so Black? What does that mean? Those kinds of insights, I felt like I really wanted to not only amplify and keep pursuing, but I wanted to share with other people. And so I thought about the podcast. I got the name of the podcast popped into my head because I just felt like I really wanted other people to meet Father Rivers the way I did. And so I thought, all right, it's time to find this person, Eric Styles. It's funny, Eric actually, can I say this? Eric, he applied for my job at UD when I left my job at Dayton, which was like director of liturgy.
Did not get it. Crystal Sullivan.
He got, poor Crystal.
Crystal Sullivan did not get the job, but it's okay.
He got another nice job. But it was funny because then I had a trace on this guy. I was like, okay, all right. So he went and so somebody said he works at Notre Dame now. So I said, okay, so Notre Dame has got a website and stuff, it's like a legit place, I could find him. So I did reach out to Eric.
Place.
It is a legit place. Eric is a legit guy at a legit place.
With a legit website that you can find.
Yeah, everybody
but
email
didn't get
Eric.
that job. But didn't get that job. Just whatever.
Right.
Crystal Sullivan.
Not legit.
No.
Email that.
We're on a committee with her. I'm just joking.
So no, we're involved with Crystal with another project now. So he really is joking. So we connected, and we had a Zoom, and we talked for 3 hours.
This is early in the Zooming, right? Before the pandemic, I knew nothing about Zoom. I didn't care about Zoom. And it's not my favorite thing in the world, even now. I love you, but that's right. We talked for 3 hours. She did not mention that we also have other shared interests. So
yes.
And that helped, right?
Yes.
So we are friends, I think, right? I think.
You think?
Yeah, right.
We'll see. The jury's still out.
Because we both really like pop culture's genre fiction, more specifically Star Wars and Star Trek. So,
especially Star Trek.
Yes, especially we share that. I mean, I like Star Wars. I really like Star Wars. I watch it all. But we also really love to talk about that stuff, right? So,
yeah.
And I think that's
art,
probably some that's probably some deep connection to all of this because I think Father Rivers likes Star Trek. So there you go.
We think we can't confirm that.
I can confirm that he liked Star Trek. I don't know if he was a fanatic, but he liked Star Trek.
He didn't have time.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, we're both passionate about art and aesthetics and also how they come together in the church's art form, which is the liturgy. And, we have lots of opinions on liturgy, some that we share, others that we debate about. And, it's just, it's been really life-giving. We have a lot of strange life. We're both the youngest of 5 children. Our initials are ES. When I write people back from the Meet Father Rivers Gmail address, I always sign my emails ES, and then I have to put in parentheses Emily Strand because it could also be Eric Styles. So, it's just the more we learn about each other, the more we're like, oh yeah, me too. Yeah. Oh, okay.
My sister
Similar
from another
personalities.
Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. I actually do have a brother, Eric, so I have to
Yeah, you can
distinguish.
have two.
I can
Okay,
have
so
two.
so yeah, we just had a connection early on, and so Emily did the first four without me. The first four episodes. I think I come in on episode five, and then we go on to interview people. And we talked just about a little bit about the podcast. We look for people who have some connection, whether it be personal or not, but usually personal, with Father Rivers, and can tell a story about if they met him, how they met him, and why his work, why his ministry, his legacy is really important. And then usually they have a story that we also get to tell, right? So we get a chance to, a more recent episode is with Marjorie Gabriel Burrow, who was one of the editors of Lead Me Guide Me, the first Lead Me Guide Me. And so
Really,
just
the
here,
ringleader editor.
yes.
Really.
Wow.
So, like,
Yeah.
so and she's in Detroit, so get a chance for us to hear her story, or William Foster McDaniel's, who's in his 80s and still who's one of the Father Rivers collaborators and arrangers.
Wow.
And so like he's still playing, he's still gigging, even though he's retired. He still goes and leaves home and leaves the state and goes and gigs. Um, so get a chance to talk to those folks, as well as to think occasionally to have a little forum to talk about some piece of music. We've got one coming up with a friend of mine and composer and arranger who's who will share. We will sit together and reflect on an album that Father Rivers produced. So he also knew Father Rivers. So just a great opportunity to explore this unique, distinct perspective that really was groundbreaking, and that we think needs to be resurfaced so that people can take it in and help them understand what really is happening in the liturgy, and what might make for effective liturgy, effective worship. That's his language. It needs to be effective. It's doing something. And what is it that it's doing on a human level? It's doing something.
Mhm. And for those who are listening and aren't super familiar yet with Father Rivers, that was obviously part of his mission. How then, in terms of the podcast, it's not so much just a music podcast.
Right.
It's a liturgical podcast, and it's so much more than just that, because Father Rivers was so much more than just that. But you have this opportunity, like you said, to touch on different aspects of his life and his ministry with the different people he
Mhm.
encountered. Was that always your intention with the podcast, or did it just kind of like spring that way as you started to brainstorm and see how it would go?
I think it was always the intention, but I think you're always delighted and surprised, even though that that's the case, when it's confirmed and someone says something in a conversation that you just didn't, like, oh yes, and then you get just it's like turning a beautiful jewel, right? You keep turning it, you keep seeing new things,
Mhm.
Hmm.
right? And you delight every time you turn it around and one more time. Oh, it's still delightful, right?
Yeah.
Right? You know.
Yeah, even like one example of that is he taught at Purcell High School, which was
Mhm.
at the time an all boys high school in Cincinnati, and that is just what young priests did. You got ordained, you got assigned to a parish, and pretty soon you got assigned to teach theology at a high school. Well, he and it probably only taught there for 4 or 5 years, but he started a drama troupe or revived it. We're not sure. He taught literature courses rather than theology. Perfect for him. And he touched the lives of these young men, mostly white young men who joined his theater troupe, or who he coaxed into his theater troupe, some of whom he coaxed in because he knew they were experiencing great personal loss. And so he pulled them into this theater troupe and had them act and had them get in touch with their feelings as young white men in the late 50s. I mean, what a service, right? And these men, to a person, the ones that survive, are deeply, deeply touched by him, talk about him as the mentor of a lifetime, talk about his kindness toward them, the excellence that he taught them, the ways of being playful with the English language, of enjoying music and art and keeping those, central to your life, even if you don't grow up to be an artist, which many of them did. One of them is now a professor emeritus of theater at, I think, Eastern Michigan. We interviewed him. And the crazy thing is that this group of men, almost to a person, all went off having to fight in the Vietnam War. Several of them did not come back. The ones that came back were deeply changed, deeply injured. Some of them struggled with addiction after the fact, mental health crises after the fact. But the ones that survived talk about how the things that he taught them in that period really sustained them for a lifetime. And I did not expect, I expected these guys to have some funny stories about Father Rivers, and it turned out to be such a profound experience talking to them. We're still, hearing about, there's reverberations. And I mean, journalists will probably tell you, I'm not a journalist. I'm a musician. I'm a liturgist. I'm a religion teacher. But journalists will probably tell you to solely focus on one person for a long form project is a mistake, But here's the thing. He is a key, to a larger world, right? And so he is this window of insight into this larger world that we can enter through talking about him and his life and his work and his words and his music, and so that's what we pursue. It's in our season 2 intro, we talk about how we talk about him and the movement he began. And it was a movement. And so we're here, so every part of his life ends up being relevant to that. And like Eric says, we get to tell a lot of other cool stories about other cool figures along the way. It even led us to be able to interview Cardinal Gregory, which was really amazing. And he was started choking up talking about Father Rivers on our podcast, which we were like, oh my gosh. And then the Cardinal choked up, and then what's next? So yeah, we can't wait. I mean, there's so many more. Ron Harbor, is somebody who we interviewed. This is some of our most popular episodes. Sorry, Cardinal Gregory, but no, he's catching up. They're all well listened to episodes, and it's just great. It's been great to hear the response from people and people for whom those light bulbs are going off. Listening to the episodes, and it's just so encouraging.
Since you started, has anyone reached out to you after you started and said, I'd like to be interviewed? I think I have something I'd like to contribute.
Yeah, Michael Jonkus did. So yeah, Michael Jonkus did.
Louis Cantor.
Brother Louis Cantor. He was one of the first ones to reach out to us and say, Father Rivers really influenced me as a musician. And so we interviewed Louis Cantor at Michael Jonkus. Like I said, Michael Jonkus said, as a young man, that he understood what it meant to compose for liturgy from listening to Father Rivers' albums. Wow. Because he understood that it can't just be some symphonic, the guy was composing Bartok, kind of fan compositions. He was mimicking Bartok as a child, Michael Jonkus, and making up these little tunes. But he realized that as a liturgical composer, you have to compose something that could be sung a cappella, or it could be sung with an orchestra. It could be performed with an orchestra. And he said, Father Rivers' music helped teach me that. He said he bought all of his expensive parchment, self-published, pieces of music. And that was a great interview. So yeah, we do have people reach out.
For those who are listening who are not familiar with Father Rivers, obviously you've shared already great stories, and clearly you can get a much clearer picture when you listen to the podcast. Shameless plug. But
thanks.
Father Rivers is going to be someone that we in the association learn about this year, especially, and focus on, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But To someone who's listening who may have never encountered him before, and this is a massive ask of you, so I understand that. Can you give a very quick, small summary of who was Father Rivers?
Sure. So he was born in 1931 in Selma, Alabama, and moved with his family to Cincinnati as a young boy, and became Catholic through Catholic education, and was enamored early on with the liturgy, and was an altar server all the way through school, and went to high school seminary, and went straight through. And he was the first black priest, black man to be ordained for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. He wasn't the first black
That's right.
priest from the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, but he's the first black person to be ordained for the Archdiocese
And
in
if I can,
1956, I think. Yeah.
yeah, and if I can break in just to say, I think as a young person hearing that story for the first time, I thought, oh, that's interesting. There were no black men who wanted to be priests before that. But
Right. No,
that's white
not.
naivety. And the fact is, they weren't allowed in the seminary. All black candidates for seminary were sent to Bay St. Louis. And Father Rivers made the conscious choice not to go to Bay St. Louis. They would take him at Cincinnati. And this was a kind of a first, a second, I think, because there was one man ordained out of Cincinnati Seminary ahead of him, but he went off to serve in a majority black country. So Father Rivers was the second black person to complete seminary in Cincinnati because they just weren't allowed to before that. It was a segregated situation. And so that in itself is a huge accomplishment. So sorry, I wanted to break in there. Eric, you want to keep going?
Yeah, I think that he's ordained in 56, and was assigned both to a parish as an assistant pastor, associate pastor, as well as to Purcell, which was Purcell, now Purcell Marian. And taught there, and was encouraged by what he calls a conservative pastor to begin to work with the congregation in the parish, which was a mixed parish, which was a changing parish, right? The neighborhood was becoming more and more black. It was not an all black parish, but it was becoming more and more black. And because of the neighborhood, St. Joseph's Parish near downtown Cincinnati. And to work with the sisters, the Oldenburg Franciscans, to enliven the liturgy, that people were the pastors were something like people were going to church only to catch hell, to avoid catching hell, right? So that the pastor wanted them to be more involved, more engaged, and so Father Rivers began to work with them liturgically, to encourage that. And that eventually led to him, among other young priests, early on in as the Second Vatican Council was happening in 1960s, right, early 1960s, to start composing music. And he had an inspiration while during turbulence on a plane, and was afraid and nervous and anxious, and so pulled his breviary out. And he said that was one of the early experimental English breviaries, and began to read it. And the text was "God is love," and so he turned that, while on the plane, turned that text, "God is love, and he who abides in love abides in God, and God in him," into a melody, and that grew, and eventually. Somehow, I'm not exactly sure, but somehow that song, he ended up singing that song in 1964. This is the 60th anniversary of the first Mass in English. And he sang that song at the first Mass in English.
Wow.
And it was a hit. It was a communion song.
The rumor is they kept
keep coming back.
They kept calling him back to sing more of it and more of it and more of it, and it was like a 10-minute standing ovation, because this is what, and your listeners will be, I hope, so interested in this. This is like the first contemporary music of note that went viral across our country. In terms of, he wrote this music, and it wasn't Italian and German Renaissance art music, Palestrina and all that stuff. It wasn't that. it was something really different. And the fact was, it was folk music. It was folk music. And of course, this ushered in a wave of Catholic folk music that came along with Ray Rep and the St. Louis Jesuits and all of those people that followed, Michael Joncas himself and all of those people that followed. But Father Rivers is sort of the figure, and his songs were the songs that gave people permission to do that. And what's interesting, has always been so interesting to me, and these are the questions I was asking as a graduate student. Why does our music sound like this? And that's why Dr. Cecilia Moore said, go talk to Father Rivers about why. And the fact is, though, what we've lost along the way is that the gateway into this contemporary music in our Catholic Church was Black sacred song, was the American classical idiom, which is Black sacred song, which is jazz, which is blue. I mean, this is our song, right? This is our American song. And so it got outshined. It definitely got outshined by the folk music movement that followed. And when I say folk, I mean white folk. But Father Rivers' music really helped to start, and his efforts at inculturation, like Eric referred to in his own parish, he started a movement of embracing Black culture in Catholic worship, and intentionally, and to help make people's participation in liturgy more effective, energetic, converting, for people to actually feel a sense of conversion, a sense of their own salvation as they participate in liturgy, rather than just going through the motions of a style of liturgy that was really a colonizing force on them.
Yeah, can I jump in and talk a little bit about what he calls, what he means by effective worship? So worship has a purpose, right? It's to in some ways, make us more human. And metanoia, change of mind and heart, catharsis. These are the terms that he would use to describe the purpose of worship is to make life more meaningful, more meaning filled, more soulful. And he uses doubles the L's to emphasize that it's the full of soul, right? And so he says that these are the things, and that worship is an art form. There's a distinct art form that uses all of the arts to impact the senses and the mind and the heart, to lead to transformation. And that worship is drama. And what he means by drama is that it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and one thing flows from the next. And the better they flow, the more people might be moved, and the more they will say, this was not God present. And so I think that's some of the thrust of what Father Rivers' method of effective worship was about, was the doing of worship. He was very much interested in the history of worship, but not more than the doing of worship. And he said he was a liturgist, and that many people who called themselves liturgists were actually liturgiologists, right? That they were scholars of the ideas around liturgy, but they often had low to no facility for effective liturgy, right? Doing liturgy.
He also felt that, again, drawing on Black culture was, something that he was doing intentionally to create effective worship. And he thought Black culture, there's aspects of Black culture that are especially useful.
That were gifted
in that, they're gifts to the church, and that the church needs to receive them better, right? Because refusing that gift is just refusing a whole aspect of our inheritance. And so these are important. And, just to kind of close the loop on his life story. So, he went on to write another mass setting called Mass for the Brotherhood of Man, Mass dedicated to the Brotherhood of Man. That was performed at the Newport Jazz Festival. to a standing ovation in the early 70s, I believe. He went on to host TV specials. He went on to perform with the Hawkins family, the gospel greats. He went on to a lot of great heights. He wrote books. He had eventually got a PhD, and he wrote many more compositions. When Cardinal Gregory heard it in the seminary, he was a teenager, a high schooler in the seminary, and he was the only Black man, in his class. And he said his choir master came out and he said, I have a new piece of music to teach everyone. And it's somebody, the composer is from Wilton's tradition. And, everybody turns and looks at Cardinal Gregory, then Wilton. And he was like, he described it as a moment is like, this could go either way. How's this going to go? But he said the music was beautiful. And everybody thought that. Everybody reacted that way, that this music, it was God is love. And so he was so proud because he felt represented in the church's music. Look at what someone who has an experience like that as a young person can go on to do. It's just phenomenal.
Clearly, I wish we could go for another, 35, 40 minutes on this topic. But thankfully, I don't have to worry about that as much because I am able to forward and give a promotion and encouragement for our listeners to go listen to your podcast. So Meet Father Rivers is available wherever you listen to podcasts. Is it also available at meetfatherrivers.com?
We don't have that so much as we have. We're hosted by Libsyn. Libsyn has a
just Google
a website. Yeah. So you can get it from all the normal places like Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all that stuff. But you can also just Google Meet Father Rivers, and the site that you can stream it at will be one of the first things that comes up.
Okay, so Google Meet Father Rivers. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that we will be able to continue the conversation on Father Rivers at this year's NPM convention. One of the plenum addresses will be provided by Ron Harbour, and his title of his plenum is Precious Memories, 3 Fountains of Catholic Faith, Father Clarence Joseph Rivers, Sister Thea Bowman, FSPA, and Mr. Leon Roberts. So that'll be one of the plenums at this year's NPM convention in Kansas City. So I'm looking forward very much to it.
Yes, I know. Ron is a great, Ron is a great supporter of our podcast. He actually composed and performs our theme music for the podcast. So big friend of the show.
Well, thank you both so much, not just for your time today, but for all of the time and effort I know it takes to put a podcast together. Both of you are clearly incredibly busy, but the work that you are doing, I really do believe is a form of ministry, sharing the story of Father Rivers and allowing the Holy Spirit to work through what you're doing, because clearly it's opening different stories, and the lives he impacted and the spirit that flows from that is so apparent. So thank you both for sharing the spirit through you. And thank you for all of the time that you're doing to honor Father Rivers' life and help us to see his work and continue in it. So thank you both for your time today.
Thanks,
Thank
Amanda.
you.